When World War II ended, the Japanese occupation of Korea ended as well. And after that, the country was divided into two occupational zones, one in the north controlled by the Soviet Union, and one in the south controlled by the US. Now, shortly after this division, the part in the South, controlled by the US, wanted to hold new elections. And most people believed that if these elections were to be held and a new government to be chosen, that would firmly establish this new division of the country. The elections resulted in the formation of a new government called the First Republic of Korea, and that, in its turn, provoked a lot of protests, strikes, and eventually an insurgency by the Workers' Party in Korea because they essentially opposed the idea of this new division of a country. Now, the First Republic of Korea started suppressing these protests, and conflicts started to escalate. In the very south of the country, in the East China Sea, there is an island called Jeju, where these conflicts and the escalation resulted in something called an eradication campaign by the government. In order to suppress the protests, they have resorted to extreme violence and committed a massacre against the local population of the Jeju island. We Do Not Part is a novel that tries to untangle the long-term consequences of this transgenerational trauma that has been imposed on the inhabitants of Jeju Island, who actually managed to survive the massacre. The novel examines the consequences of the massacre through the prism of a female friendship. There are two women involved, one called Kyunga and the other one called Inseon. I could be mispronouncing these names because they are Korean and I don't speak Korean, but this is the only way I know how to pronounce them, so bear with me. Inseon is the one who ends up at a hospital. She's injured and she needs help from Kyunga to go to her house in Jeju Island and feed one of her two pet birds who she's afraid will die because of her absence, because there's no one there to take care of her. Now, the story is told from Kyunga's perspective. First, we follow her traveling to Jeju Island. Then we see her at Inseon's house, and we actually get to kind of unravel the story of Inseon and what happened through a great part, or to a great extent, Kyunga's memories of the conversations she's had with her friend. Now, the novel jumps back and forth through time a lot, chapter to chapter, and a large portion of storytelling comes also through the recollections of Kyunga's dreams, but dreams of some other characters in the story as well. And as the novel progresses, this line between what's a dream or what's real kind of starts to blur, and in the end, it completely spirals off in the second half of the novel, and it doesn't give any logical explanation as to why or what that means. Now, due to all this, the novel is divided into three parts. The first part is called Bird and focuses on Kyunga's journey to Jeju Island. The second part is called Night, and it's basically this dreamlike sequence of Kyunga's stay at Inseon's house and how she immerses herself into Inseon's family story. This whole part is in itself open to interpretation since it in many ways parts with reality without any explanation as to how or why. When Kyunga arrives to the house at first, she doesn't actually manage to save the bird. She finds the bird dead. But in that second part called Night, that bird will suddenly come back to life and will kind of like open this portal of inexplicable events, because at that point Kyunga starts to see Inseon in the same room and she's kind of being led through the family story by Inseon, who shows her all this memorabilia in the house, letters, photo albums, different small bits and pieces that kind of help help her puzzle together what it is that actually happened. Now, the last part of the book is called Flame, and it's both the ending of the novel and the ending of that dreamlike sequence. And it takes place after the whole conversation, after everything has been sort of put together as a story. Inseon takes Kyunga to a water crossing, to a place where her parents used to come to in the past, and they have this candle with them because it's dark and everything is happening at night and in the winter, and the candle kind of blows out due to the wind and the cold. And in the last bit, what happens is that Kyunga is trying to reignite the flame and manages to do it. So that is the very last sentence of the novel, and why this last part is called that. Now, on top of these three parts, each part is divided into chapters, and even those chapters are kind of divided up into multiple sections because of all the jumping between timelines, narrators, dream, reality, all of these shifts. It requires a lot of formatting throughout the book. I personally find that to be, on the one hand, a bit challenging because you have to keep track of who's talking, when, in which context what you're reading about is taking place. But on the other hand, when I have a highly formatted book like that, I feel like it's way easier to read through it because it gives me a sense of flow. Everything is divided up into chunks, and I feel like it goes way faster to actually read the book. Now, in order to analyze the book, I've decided to divide it up into these four main themes or symbols, if you wish, that I believe the author uses to explain how I understood the story of We Do Not Part.
I say quietly, dreams are terrifying things. No, they are humiliating. They reveal things about you that you weren't even aware of. Dreams are a central theme of this novel, and I would argue potentially its most important literary vessel. If you look at it, the novel both opens up and ends with a dream. It starts with a nightmare that Kyunga has, and it ends with this dreamlike sequence of Kyunga and Insan together in the snow trying to reignite a fire. Actually, the entire second part of the novel can be interpreted as a dream in its entirety, the second and third part. Why I think this was a significant literary vessel in the novel is because dreams happen somewhere between the conscious and the unconscious. They allow us to access hidden part of ourselves, but they also allow us some access to certain collective memories that we have, but might be out of our reach on an everyday basis. What I think is interesting about the way the story is told is the fact that we are actually hearing Inseon's story. She's the one whose parents have survived the massacre. She is the one who has lived through the trauma somewhat firsthand, let's say. But actually, it is not she who is telling the story. The channel through which the story is told is actually Kyunga and her dreams. While interesting, I think it has to do with the idea of proximity. Because Insun is the one whose story is being told, it also makes her too vulnerable, too fragile, it makes it too intense for her to do a deep dive into this huge trauma that's sort of waiting to be unpacked. Instead, Hyunga represents, through the idea of a friend and somebody who's genuinely interested both in Inseon and in the historical event, she represents, in my opinion, a safe distance from which the trauma can be explored. I had the impression reading the book that what Han Kang wanted to do was explore all the ways in which this kind of collective trauma impacts not only those who have personally been through it, but also the rest of the society. It kind of plays with the idea of how we can connect to each other depending on the different levels of proximity and involvement in certain historical events. And I think that in a really good way, she opens up space for connection between people who may have very different positions there. Somebody who's maybe very directly been through a certain event, or someone who maybe was more of an observer, but was still affected by the fact that it was happening. Through this friendship of Kyunga and Inseon, I think Han Kang opens up also a space where we can hold the idea that despite these different levels of experience, if we're open-minded enough and open-hearted enough, we are capable of these deep levels of empathy that are necessary in order to be able to bridge that gap between people and to mutually process the really bad things that have happened. Another aspect of using dreams as a literary vessel for me is the fact that they represent a liminal space. They represent a space, the way I read it in this novel, between life and death. And that is how I perceived most of the characters throughout the book. Their existence was like that, lingering somewhere between life and death, somewhere between the past and the present, trying to, or rather clinging on to certain things in the past and not being able to let go. And very often trying to bring something or someone lost back to life. Now, throughout the novel, Han Kang uses various elements of nature to serve as a metaphor for something that has been lost. One of those symbols from the very beginning of the novel have been trees. To begin with, the novel takes place in the winter, at a time when trees are bare and create a haunted-like presence and atmosphere in the novel. In fact, one of Kyunga's nightmares happens in a black forest and is described in the following way. Over black trees, chopped down to torsos, dazzling hexagonal crystals form, then crumble. After having that dream, Kyunga, who is researching the massacre in the aims of writing a book about it, describes that she and her friend Inseon, who is a documentary filmmaker, plan on doing a sort of a collaborative project of replanting the trees exactly in that place from her dream. Planting them in thousands might not be feasible, but 99, a number that opens to infinity, could work. And then, together with a dozen or so of people of shared purpose, we could clothe the trees in black miyok. Ink them with the same devotion with which one might swaddle them in gowns woven out of deep night, so that their sleep may remain eternally unbroken. I read it so that the trees symbolize the people who have lost their lives in the massacre, people who these two artists wish to maybe lift from oblivion in this gesture and then make them something more than just victims statistic. And through that acknowledgement, gift them the ability to finally rest in peace. Now, the main plot of this novel is that Kyunga is traveling to Jeju to feed one of Inseon's birds, who Inseon is worried might not survive because of their absence, because they have to stay at the hospital. I think that the bird in this book generally is a multi-layered symbol. On the one hand, I can see the most maybe simple and direct metaphor of the bird symbolizing life, or the struggle to stay alive, or to be rescued in the last moment through the kindness of a stranger, but also as a symbol of lightness and freedom, a symbol of a full exploration of life and its possibilities, as opposed to living as a shadow of oneself, which has been the destiny of so many who survived the massacre. And it also opens up the question of what does it mean to survive such a horrid event. So when Kyunga actually arrives to Inseon's house in Jeju, she realizes that she's too late. The bird had sadly passed away and she wasn't able to save it. And she has a surge of guilt over that and sadness, and she decides to bury the bird in front of the house underneath a tree. And this part marks the end of the first section of the novel called Bird. The next part, called Night, however, will bring this bird back to life and mark the split from reality for Kyunga. So in the beginning of the second part, very suddenly, this bird out of nowhere starts clapping its wings and flying around. And as the bird comes back from the underworld, Kyunga starts seeing Inseon, who is physically still at the hospital, but she starts seeing her, and Inseon takes her on this journey through her family's story by showing her all of these different bits and pieces of memorabilia that they have, like pictures, letters, maps. So she describes not only how her family struggled to survive, and how certain family members lost their lives, but also how one of her uncles was technically never found, in a sense, never found. His body was never found, so he was more declared disappeared than he was actually established to have literally been killed during the massacre. And this is something that her mother bears with her throughout her life, trying repeatedly to look for him and never kind of losing hope that he might come back to life. Now, there are various things that this coming back to life of bird can signify. It could be marking the beginning of a dream. It could be some kind of a psychotic split from reality. It could be just magical realism in literature. I've even considered the possibility that Kyunga actually dies, and this whole second and third section of the book is basically an exploration of what happens to her post-mortem, like to her consciousness. However, if I look at it through the prism of what a bird might mean, I feel like the bird is the most powerful most powerful actor in the story. So for one, it triggers the whole plot line, which like gives the story momentum. On the other hand, it is a symbol or a metaphor for life and freedom. And then finally, it seems to be the gatekeeper to another reality. And in that reality, the weight of trauma is unburdened and explored, and the characters are allowed to move on, as in the final sentence of the novel, for example.
Up leaped the flame, like a blooming heart, like a pulsing flower bud, like the wing beat of an immeasurably small bird.
The final element is omnipresent throughout the novel as it takes place in the winter, and that element is snow. Similarly to birds, the snow has a dual meaning, which I find so beautifully put in this particular quote.
People say light as snow, but snow has its own heft, which is the weight of this drop of water.
Now, snow brings a certain heaviness to the atmosphere of the novel. When I imagined it, I imagined not only snowflakes, but also in the deep winter when a layer upon layer of snow piles up on top of each other and creates this incredible weight. I saw that weight of the snow as the weight of the past. That's the layers of the past piling up on each other, creating a huge emotional burden that the characters are condemned to having to carry. Now, the snow has another dimension to it, which is, of course, temperature. And the snow symbolizes the cold, the frozen, and in a sense contributes to the sense that characters are kind of frozen in time or maybe held back in the past, not being able to escape the grip of what has happened before. And it is precisely that which holds the characters back from being able to make sense of the present and the future.
After surviving that hell, would he still have been the kind of person who made choices we could understand?
Finally, there is another duality to snow as a symbol, and that is movement, I want to say. So on the one hand, we can imagine things like just being covered in snow, very, very still, very kind of like frozen image impression. But at the same time, snow can imply movement. Like on the way, as Kyunga is traveling to Jeju, she experiences a snow blizzard, and snow blizzard in itself is like a struggle to get through. So I think that the blizzard, in that form, in that movement, snow as the blizzard, represents the events of the massacre that people were struggling to survive. On the other hand, when the blizzard is over, when the massacre is over, there is a stillness, right? After the snowstorm, there is this calm, frozen stillness. And that's kind of like after the massacre when there is just death in the air because everything is still, everything is calm. It's just the image of all the lives lost. Stillness and death are closely related in that sense because death essentially represents the ending of movement, the ending of life. Also, symbolically, after someone passes away, there is usually a moment of silence, and it's about the silent contemplation of the fact that a life has ended. This is the silence that permeates this novel from the beginning to the end. Paradoxically, all of the thoughts, the memories, the dreams, all of the narrative that's happening in the book, it's happening against the backdrop of this particular kind of silence. And it is this post-mortem silence that actually becomes the soundtrack for the story that is being told. So I read this book because it was recommended to me in the comments on one of the previous videos that I've done, and the commenter said that they would like to hear my take on it. So I hope this reaches the person who was curious. I'm incredibly grateful that this book was recommended because it is a very unique book in a sense. Well, first for me, in terms of the style and language in which it was written, which I thought was really beautiful. It's kind of a book it's very slow paced, it's character driven, it deals with difficult topics, so it kind of does it layer by layer. It kind of like addresses one thing at a time, but also gives the time necessary to process each layer and acknowledge it in all of its complexity, which is really great. It is also like, if I could sum up my impressions in the shortest possible way, I would say that this book perfectly embodies that principle. I don't know whose quote it is, but that says, good art should disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. And this is exactly the capacity that this book has. For those that maybe haven't experienced something traumatic like this, it will be a very intense experience to read about it. But to those who maybe have had such a heavy traumatic experience, I can also imagine it being a very soothing, you are not alone kind of piece of literature. And just for that, I think it is a direct recommendation for me. I didn't know about Han Kang before she won the Nobel Prize. A little bit embarrassed about that, but I'm happy I've discovered her. I will be reading more of her, and until next time.